1 second, Solange. People is still joining.
I guess somebody will be introducing, right? The whole thing.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Bueno, buenos días con todas, con todos. Solo para
Good morning to
recordarles,
everyone.
tenemos
Let us
interpretación
remind you that we
en este webinario.
have today
Puedan, por
simultaneous
favor,
interpretation, so in case you need it,
a través de las herramientas del Zoom, donde está el globo que dice
you can choose the language of your preference in the lower part of your Zoom screen. Thank you. Good morning to everyone. For me, it's a pleasure and an honor to be the moderator of this session, which will be about how NDCs of Indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants, and local communities are able to ensure that specific forest tenure objectives are integrated into climate change mitigation strategies. We will have with us the director of the resources director and the coordinator of the also RRI, Solange Paliaki Banki. Good morning. We'll be joined also by Francisco Perez, who is the senior associate of RRI. And in this session, we will also have Fernanda Almeida, who is a consultant for RRI and who will present a comparative study of these NDCs in the region. So without further ado, we will begin our webinar. Solange, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Margarita. Always a pleasure to see you, and thank you for your support. Greetings to everyone. Good morning, depending on where you're joining from, or good afternoon or good evening. We gather here today to talk about the nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. But most importantly, we are here to specifically address the inclusion of Indigenous, Afro-descendant, and local community rights and self-determination in national climate pledges and in the NDCs. Research science has shown that recognizing and protecting Indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro-descendants people territories conserves global carbon sinks and the biodiversity of ecosystems everywhere. In fact, their lands are home to around 34% of the Amazon's basin carbon stock, one of the largest carbon sinks on the planet. This is really a big number, right? 34% of the carbon sinks in the Amazon are in indigenous territories. We also know that systems of climate mitigation commonly put forward, like carbon capture or carbon storage technology, are 5 to 42% more expensive than titling indigenous and Afro-descendant territories. Therefore, ensuring land tenure is the most effective and proven methods of climate change mitigation. It's no surprise then that deforestation rates in indigenous and tribal territories were about 50% lower than other areas in 2021. Again, here, deforestation rates lower in indigenous territories. And since so today, as we discuss national level climate action plans, we must keep in mind that ensuring territorial rights of the local stewards of land is one of the most effective, fair, and economic climate solutions available. Since the Paris Agreement, countries have committed to reducing emissions and building resilience through NDCs. The first NDCs focused on broader mitigation and adaptation goals, And while many countries updated their commitment in 2020 and 2021, what we have realized is that collective land rights remained largely neglected. One of the biggest gaps is about recognizing collective land rights within the NDCs. So now, as government shape NDCs 3.0 for 2025 and 2026, we must recall that the Paris Agreement calls for the highest possible level ambition, which must include full legal recognition and direct financing to the communities. This is a historic opportunity to correct past omissions and elevate collective territorial rights to their deserved place in national and global climate strategies. Countries such as Brazil, Colombia, Peru, and the Dominican Republic are currently at different stages of review of their NDCs. That means the NDC process is still alive and in progress. So now is our time to call for a change. I'm very happy to report that many governments are now requesting concrete input from community organizations who are mobilizing to offer that input with the support of the RRI Global Coalition. So this webinar is just one part of the greater work to help both governments and donors to improve the inclusion of territorial rights in the NDCs. The Indigenous peoples, Afro-descendant peoples, and local communities should be the protagonists, the heroes of NDCs. Inclusion of their right in NDCs is not a favor, but a right, a strategic necessity to even begin meeting global climate goals. Within this community, we also honor the voices of elders, women, and youth who, along with traditional knowledge accumulated over generations, are essential for conserving biodiversity and addressing the climate crisis. And before the webinar start, I would like to thank our Latin America team at RRI, led by my colleague Carla Cardenas, who is the director, for organizing this webinar with the RRI Coalition in Latin America. And of course, our dear facilitator today, Margarita Flores, who is also a fellow of RRI, and we're very grateful for your leadership in bringing together voices from across the region to be part of this webinar. This is really deeply appreciated. And last, as we all know, in these troubling times, solidarity is the beating heart of today's conversation and the way forward. So we humbly invite governments, donors, and civil society to work together to make NDCs 3.0 more just, inclusive, and effective, and to make COP30 in Brazil a historic milestone for this agenda. I thank you all for your kind attention, and Margarita, the floor is yours. Thank you again for joining us.
Muchas gracias, Solange. Muy
Thank
clara
you,
tu
Solange.
intervención.
Your intervention was
Y
very clear.
solamente
Let me
pasaba a
just
decir que soy
say that
parte de
I
Ambiente y
just
Sociedad
make part
y
of
fellow
Ambiente y Sociedad and
de
fellow
RRI.
of
En tal calidad,
RRI.
doy paso
In that
a
sense,
Francisco
I'll
Pérez,
give the floor to
nos va a hacer
Francisco
una
Perez, who
pequeña
will
encuesta de todas las personas.
do a very
Ya son
brief
muchísimas las que están
poll
atendiendo esta
of
webinar. Francisco, por
all the
favor.
people who are attending this webinar. Francisco, the floor is yours.
Bueno, gracias, Margarita.
Thank you,
Sí, acabo
Margarita.
de abrir,
Yeah,
bueno,
I
lanzar
just
la encuesta.
launched
Entonces,
our
si
poll,
todos, si
our
todos
survey.
pueden
So all of
contestar, son tres
you
preguntas muy puntuales
can answer
para
those three very
darnos
specific
un poco de
questions.
información de quiénes son las personas que
The
están
idea is for us to
participando hoy
know
con nosotros.
who are participating today with
Vamos a
us.
dejar por unos minutos mientras que
We will
la
leave
gente
this
responde.
just a few
Gracias.
seconds so you can answer the poll. Thank you.
Bueno, tenemos 50% respondiendo.
Okay, so 50% of you already answered. And we are still waiting for others to do so.
No encuentran el link. No sé si
Giovanni,
se sigue viendo
sí,
la
no es
pantalla.
un link, sino que
No, it is not a
abre
link.
el mismo
Within
donde
the
los
same
invitamos a
Zoom,
responder
you can
las tres
open
preguntas.
and you can there see the 3 questions of the survey.
$55 respuestas.
55 answers.
Bueno, gracias, Daniel, por si ponen las respuestas acá en el chat. Giovanni, tal vez si estás
Perhaps, yes, we
no
will.
sale la encuesta en sí, puedes también responder a las preguntas que
Well,
son
you can
qué país
answer the
conecta,
questions here,
tu género
specifically from
y tipo de
what's your
organización,
gender, from what country you're
forma
connecting,
parte.
and what is the organization you belong to. Those are the 3 questions. Maybe we can also write them down in the chat.
Tenemos algunos minutos todavía más, Francisco, o
Francisco, do we have a bit, let's say a couple more
Ya,
minutes?
tal vez unos 30 segundos más, Margarita, y
Only 30
ya
seconds more, Margarita.
subimos la encuesta
And
y
then we will be
podemos ver
closing
las
our
respuestas.
poll and we would then talk about all the answers.
Están poniendo muchísimos en el chat. Tenemos gente de
Yeah,
Myanmar,
we have people from
Guatemala,
Myanmar, Guatemala, Ghana,
Colombia.
Colombia,
Muy bien.
Ecuador,
pueblos indígenas, pueblos afrodescendientes.
Indigenous peoples, Afro-descendant peoples also.
Creo que ya estamos,
I
Francisco.
believe that we are ready now, Francisco. Francisco, you're muted.
Ahí están una de las respuestas a
Here we have,
la encuesta. Creo que sí, ahora sí, ¿cierto? Las respuestas.
so here
Igual
we
lo
have
podemos
the
también
answers.
grabar y compartir con
We can
participantes,
also
para
share
responder,
them
en el taller,
with
pero,
other
muchas
participants after
gracias
this
por
webinar.
responder,
But
por responder y
thank you
por estar
all
acá.
for answering and specifically for being here with us.
Sí. Creo que es importante.
I
Tenemos
think
acá
it's
bastantes
important
pueblos
because
indígenas,
we have
afrodescendientes,
many
y
Afro-descendants and
bastantes,
Indigenous
bastantes
peoples,
NGOs. Los
as well
bienvenidos,
as
bienvenidos a
NGOs.
todos y
So
también
all of you are very welcome, as well as people from the academia.
sigamos.
Let us continue then.
¿ya podemos seguir?
Can we continue now?
Bueno,
Okay.
entonces entramos
So
en la presentación
I am going
del
now
estudio
to present
comparativo
the comparative
sobre
study
15
about
constituciones
15
nacionales
national
determinadas de diversos países de
or
América
NDCs
Latina,
of
la que
diverse
nos
countries
va a
from Latin
presentar
America.
Fernanda Almeida. El,
And
el,
this will be
el corazón
presented
de
by
la
Fernanda Almeida.
investigación
The heart of
es
the
saber cuál es el
research is to
modelo,
know
cuáles
what's the
son los
model.
aspectos
What
esenciales
are the
que
essential
debería una
aspects
NDC
that an
incluir
NDC
para que sea
include
viable
in order for it to be feasible, that is to say that there are territorial rights of indigenous peoples as Afro-descendant peoples and local communities in order to tackle mitigation in these NDCs. So Fernanda is our RRI consultant specialist in these forest topics, together with Afro-descendant peoples, indigenous peoples and communities. Thank you, Margarita, and thank you, Solange, as well as Carla, for the opportunity to develop this study and be able to present all of you. So thank you so much to all of you who are here today and to learn what we are also doing, as recognizing the work of Ana Rocha from my team, who has been a great support collecting the data. What are we going to talk about today? Well, first, what Solange mentioned, but now in a very concrete way, of how the demands from communities of indigenous peoples and Afro-descendant peoples, as well as local communities, are being represented or not efficiently in the NDCs of countries, and what are the gaps, and then what should be done? What are the opportunities that we can learn from this very concrete view of NDCs from 15 countries? Let us continue, Francisco. These are the countries out of which we analyzed their NDCs. And as Solange mentioned, the importance of this document is because it's there. The country says itself how it will contribute to have a global objective of keeping this rate in 1.5 or maximum 2 degrees. There is where the country says from its climate policy that will be doing to reach that objective. We want the contribution of communities, both indigenous, locals, and Afros, to be recognized. Out of these countries, just 3 of them have presented recently updated NDCs, which are Belize, Brazil, and Ecuador. So NDCs of those countries tells us that we could expect what's the trend as the demands are included in the NDCs that have been submitted currently. And besides that, the NDCs that we looked at were the last. If we want to reach something or aim for something, it's important to know where we are at. And that is what we are going to understand today in this couple of minutes. We have 7 main actions. I can't talk much about them in detail, but for you to know that there is more information that RRI has been collecting and that we can provide support. And today we will be focusing around territorial rights.
Entonces, ¿cuáles son algunas conclusiones preliminares? La primera es que las NDCs, de una manera general, reconocen la narrativa de que los pueblos
NDCs would recognize the narrative
mantengo solamente
that
los pueblos
indigenous
indígenas
peoples
son actores climáticos
are
importantes
important
contra la
climate
reducción
actors
del cambio climático.
in the fight
O
against
sea, se
climate
reconoce en la
change.
introducción
So
de la
it is
NDC,
recognized
hace referencia a
in the
algunas
introduction where the
legislaciones que
NDCs
reconocen
refers
sus
to
derechos. Sin
legislations that
embargo,
recognize
este reconocimiento de
their rights.
narrativa
However,
no
this
se
recognition
acompaña
will
de
not
medidas y acciones
or be
concretas
accompanied by
para que se ponga en
specific
práctica
and
sus
concrete
demandas.
measures so that these demands are
Especialmente en
put
la cuestión de
into
los pueblos
practice. So
indígenas,
this is
se hace muy
precisely why
importante
it
que
is
al
so important
plantear una demanda
to
en la ronda
state
de
a demand
negociación, por
in a
ejemplo,
negotiation
que
round
no solo se diga lo que quiere, pero
that
que
not
se
only
sepa
states what is
cómo llegar a
wanted,
eso. O sea, si la
but to
demanda es
have the
reconocimiento
clear path
territorial,
towards it. If the
¿cuáles
demand is
territorios se quiere
territorial
reconocer?
recognition, which
¿Dónde están
recognition should be
localizadas?
recognized?
¿Hay
Where are they
brecha en la
located?
legislación que
Is
tiene
there a gap
que
in the
ser
legislation that has to be
reformada?
reformed?
Porque ya se reconoce que
Because
esta
it is
poblaciones,
recognized that
estos
these
pueblos tienen
populations,
un rol
these Populations have an important role in the fight against climate change. On the other hand, regarding Afro-descendant communities and local communities have a different situation. Not all or just a few NDCs recognize their contribution to climate change, which indicates that it is important to conduct an awareness raising initiative to collect data about the input, the contribution of these populations towards climate change, such as publications by RRI, by Conic EI, that show the deforestation rates that are now lower in those populations. So this type of information is key to justify the importance of recognizing their demands within the context of climate change related policy. And here we have data this statement is based upon. There are a very not necessarily strong statements that were of people who were part of the negotiation round. So it is 100% of NDCs mention indigenous populations, only 53% mention Afro-descendant peoples, and 10% out of 80% mention local communities. Where every country has its classification of what these communities are. However, in terms of the rights of territories and the recognition of the contribution of the territory to the struggle against climate change, only 40% of them mention indigenous populations, and what was mentioned before, only 6%, just one country, Colombia, mentioned the importance of forests and Afro-descendant populations to combat climate change. And this is very relevant because most of these countries have a national legislation that recognizes some type of territorial right to this population. So there is a gap in terms of the recognition of the contribution to climate. And only one country, Bolivia, mentions the importance of local communities, in the case peasant populations, that many of other countries also have it, and also have regulations that recognize the territorial rights of these communities and populations in their countries. And there is an example in the NDC of Bolivia that talks about the planning of climate management that should be developed by respecting the rights of nations of the indigenous populations, the original indigenous and peasant populations. Francisco, can we please go to the next slide? We were expecting this, but our hopes were that Brazil, Belize, and Ecuador should have included the territorial recognition as part of a mitigation strategy in their indices that were presented most recently. And this is not what we found. Only Ecuador mentions this, and I want to bring this up because it's a general, it mentions it generally, but the territorial legislation will be promoted within the national system of protected areas and forests, meaning the land legislation will be promoted not everywhere or anywhere in Ecuador, but in protected areas. So it is very important that while we analyze the proposals of these countries to be attentive to detail, because many of the territories that want to be recognized may not be within the areas suggested by the state as part of the mitigation strategy. The legalization of these lands may not be included. So it is very important to pay attention to detail. Another important point is how Ecuador will be promoting the legislation of the land. It's still not included in the NDC. The negotiation, the struggle, the importance of continuing to promote the demands required or wanted demands, that this is still under negotiation, because Ecuador is foreseeing that the how will be defined in a document that comes after, which is the Red Action Plan and the National Climate-Related Policies. And it is important to take advantage of the effort of these demands and being included in the NDC so that it could be as concrete as possible and to guarantee the inclusion of set demands of peoples and local communities in the climate-related national policy based on this instrument and not wait until later, which can dilute the initial conquer achieved by the NDC. Next slide, please. The energy transition, the fair energy transition is still not guaranteed. This is a piece of data I was not expecting, meaning that only 3 out of 15 countries analyzed mentioned the previous and free informed consultation about the need of conducting it in the context of its national climate policy beliefs. Guyana, Honduras, and no other country mentions clearly any reparation mechanisms or compensation measures in the case of the breaching of the rights of local people and community, local peoples and communities. So this is a concept that we need to work on in order to advance the national policies within the context of the Paris Accord. Next slide, please. And this is something that we mentioned because of the dangers within the climate policy that are entailed in the energy transition. How is the country managing the exploitation of the necessary minerals for the energy transition? Why? Because we know that there is a great overlapping of these areas with the territories of the indigenous Afro-descendant people and also with the local populations. And normally speaking, they are not in the same part of the NDC. So the country needs to address everything pertaining to the energy transition. So we need to pay attention to those parts that we usually not look at so carefully in the NDCs. And also Mexico as declaring lithium as a strategic mineral within its climate policy. So we need to be really careful with this. We need to make sure or try to attempt to include safeguards for this exploitation. And Brazil just mentions it very shyly, but we need to pay attention as to how this resolution mentions what is included, since the main topic to find the resources and the investigation is, well, the development of innovation in terms of this transition minerals. So it implies political will, a strategy, a prioritization of the exploitation of these minerals as part of their climate policy. An interesting case is the case of Panama that mentions a change of the exploitation of copper or shifting to an open pit copper mining that now prohibited. So this is mentioned as a political and legal conflict that led to the prohibition of this copper open pit mining. So this is important to bear in mind because we need to pursue what we're seeking. And only Colombia recognizes the need of creating spaces to address the conflicts in the mining industry. But once again, this is mentioned only in a very general fashion. Francisco, next slide, please. So this is what I wanted to touch on. We, so far, in the NDC 2.0, we have a very nice statement. I will start to read it. Colombia recognizes the key role that local communities perform in the achievement of the climate action goals. So these are very beautiful words, but next slide, please. But in order for these words to come into fruition or to turn into actions, it is important that as a movement or organization, we know how to address the demands. So if the demand is for direct financing, how will this happen? Through funds, through windows and funds that are already existing, or the main demand, for example, the recognition, the legal recognition of the territory. But what territory exactly needs to be recognized? So this needs to be set out in detail in what legal stage of the recognition process is the country going through. So this in order to have clarity during negotiation rounds about the problem, but also the solution. The demand is the problem, but the actions towards the implementation of the demand will be the solution. So this is why, along with Carla and the RRI colleagues, we are developing this ideal model in order to provide support, and Carla will be speaking about this a little bit more later on. Here we have just an example of what I have discussed. There's an important point I perhaps failed to mention. It is important for the demand to become a goal. We need to state a year. For example, I need my country to be recognized by 2035, 2025, or 2035. We need to be able to measure progress. We want the territory to be recognized, not so many hectares of Indigenous and Afro-descendant communities, territories. So it has to be specific, determined in time, measurable. These goals need to be measurable and need to be specific. Please. Well, so far, this is what I wanted to introduce. Those of us who are, well, what we have found. These are our findings. I hope this has been useful for all of you. We will continue to carry out the study and sharing the data found. We will also include. Well, in reality, we have already concluded with Latin American countries. We will continue with Africa and Asian countries and African countries. And we are expecting to disclose the model of the NDCs being addressed. Thank you very much and continue to enjoy this webinar. Thank you very much, Fernanda. I think this is one of those very good examples of how RRI contributes in order to set the basis of what the discussion and definition of policies will be like in the future. In these NDCs, like as you say, they include many beautiful words, but sometimes just a few measures to make them truly feasible. Thank you very much, Fernanda. And we will now have a panel session where people, Afro-descendant and Indigenous populations, will be telling us or sharing their efforts in terms of inclusion of territorial rights within the scheme of the NDCs. Therefore, we will have the participation of 4 very important regions, organizations of the region. The first one represented by Alberto Terrana of the Articulation of Indigenous Peoples of Brazil, APIB. The other one represented by Osvaldo Moga. I am pleased to share that he is my country fellow, and he is the director of the Indigenous Peoples Organization of the Amazon, a well-known leader. And the third representative is Levi Sucre, also a colleague of mine of the Mesoamerican Alliance of Peoples and Forest, MPV of Costa Rica, and Luis Sierra. We're closing this panel, Marino Castina, a member of the National Coordination of Articulation of the Black Communities, CONAC, in Brazil. So, with further ado, we will start the panel and we hand it over to Alberto Terena. Alberto, the floor is yours.
Obrigado, bom dia a todas as pessoas presentes neste encontro tão importante.
Good morning, everyone. It is a very important encounter for all of us.
Eu sou Alberto Terena, de Mato Grosso do Sul, da aldeia Buriti.
Like it has been mentioned, I am Alberto Terena from Alberta Putui, from Brazil, from the Terena Council of the northern region of Mato Grosso do Sul. PIB is about the articulation of indigenous populations of Brazil, recognized by all of you, made up of 7 base organizations. Since Clifford was not able to attend, I am here standing in from him. Once again, to us, it is a pleasure to be able, it is very gratifying to be able to build this and address these challenges together. Challenges pertaining to climate change, the climate crisis. And we are on the verge of having a very important conference of the parties, and we cannot miss it. We must make sure that we attend this COP as members of the people's organizations. To us, peoples and communities, it is our duty to be there. I want to say that there is, or I will briefly present and speak about what we have done as part of the articulation of the indigenous peoples of Brazil, of PEEP, what we are trying to do in an attempt to address this matter. So it is very important to share this advocacy with all of you. We know that indigenous populations, just as we have been hearing from you about the importance within this context of preservation, the importance that we are attentive within this context of territorial living and experiences. We
have many things of how
much
to contribute and also
help,
it's necessary
but
to have
it is important
practices
for countries
of the countries so that these actions that have been developed along the years, these actions should be in fact or be an advocacy in order to tackle climate crisis of the planet. COP30, COP30 has this renewal of the commitment of peoples regarding the Paris Accord. Important moment to analyze how many countries are committed in order to tackle that climate change. We know which official documents that record our commitments, and NDC become strategy documents by prioritizing the needs of the countries. And it also is a portfolio of climate investment for countries, Brazil and the world. They talk about the importance of indigenous peoples for this climate change. Indigenous peoples, which are the guardians of the climate and biodiversity. And we also say that we are the guardians, but we need a progress and advance in the forms of recognizing the role of peoples beyond the words. It's what we were talking about a while ago. The world talks, the world says, and refers to the importance, as my peer said, where she mentioned it, and here inside of our territories we also have it, but we have to recognize this beyond the words and beyond the documents. this must be transformed into actions so that these official NDCs arrive in a structured way to the COP, and also to look for a commitment on the side of the countries, commitment of those countries that affect the most on biodiversity. So that's why the Brazil movement insisted in advocating in the NDC Brazil's text, describing very clearly all the demands and how they would wish to be represented in NDCs in Brazil. That's why we've written a comprehensive document which brings together our policies and all the active advocacy, so that they must go together to the official NDCs, and that the NDC incorporates this language in their texts. So this is a summary, at least this text, which has been written by ACTIC, and that we make part of. So we state the mitigation and the recognition of the demarcation and protection of indigenous peoples as a climate policy, specific objectives as well as terms. Second, the adaptation, the implementation, integration of the national policy of the protection of indigenous territories, and also the management territorial tools as well as environmental as a tool of adaptation led by indigenous peoples and others. Third, a fair transition, elimination of fossil fuels, to also stop monocrops for indigenous territories. Fourth, climate financing, have direct access, and at least 40% of resources for indigenous funds without intermediaries, climate justice and comprehensive respect to all of the indigenous needs, the protection of defenders, advocates, and climate instances. Sixth, traditional recognition of knowledges and indigenous systems as technology, legitimate technology of mitigation, adaptation, and its protection against lands, also climate connection and biodiversity, oceans, seas, with the objective of closing or stopping deforestation until 2030, and increase subsidizing in order to bring benefits for nature. And that will be like a summary that we as indigenous movements work around the policy, so that we could always fight for NDCs and in their recognition. The Ministry of Indigenous Peoples of Brazil has embraced these NDCs made by FIP, and together they are presenting or submitting for the Ministry of Environment of Brazil, so that they become officialized. Everything that we've worked so hard for. So this is a great beginning for us. And within these challenges from the Brazilian government, the idea is to acquire this responsibility, because we need to be present in this important moment where we are deciding the building of climate change and how it affects all of us. I want to thank the opportunity on behalf of APIC. Thank you very much. Thank you, Alberto, for your intervention and your participation. It's very important to have your contribution for NDC, and hopefully it should be incorporated comprehensively in the official document. Let me make a suggestion. We still have 8 minutes per participant, so now we pass the floor to Osvaldo Munca, the president of OPIAC. Good morning, Osvaldo.
Hola, muy buenos días. ¿Cómo están?
Good morning. How are you?
Bueno,
We're
me
doing
alegra,
fine.
me alegra, Margarita,
Well,
saludarla y verla de nuevo.
I'm happy to see you all.
Carla,
Carla,
ver por allí algunos. No, esperando que esta mañana sea
Hopefully this morning
bendecido por el Padre Creador.
will be blessed
Muchas gracias a él por
by God the Creator,
permitirnos
and
reunirnos hoy.
thanks to Him who allowed us to meet with us. I am saluting you from Opiac.
En este momento estoy
Currently,
durmiendo, pero bueno, ¿cierto? Yo soy pescador y cazador.
I am a fisherman and a hunter. I am from the Tiger Clan, as you know. I usually sleep during the day and hunt at night. But here I am, Margarita.
8 minutos,
You
Osvaldo.
have 8 minutes. Yeah, I'll only take 4.
De carreta, dijo los estos.
I will go straight to the
Bueno,
point.
saludarlos y
Let me then again salute you. And this meeting, it's important from Opiac,
Amazonía colombiana,
the Colombian Amazon region, which has 27 million of hectares. It's half of Colombia, 64 indigenous peoples that we represent. It's important to highlight that work that the Amazon indigenous movement makes by preserving the life of humanity. And
nosotros ya hemos hecho varios temas de trabajo.
according to several topics we've worked
Y
around.
voy a tratar de aportar unos temas importantes que nosotros tenemos acá desde
So it's important then to talk about the topics we have in OPIAC. There is some data to clarify from our side. And before beginning that very quick conversation, the scope of NDC goes according to the progress and development that the norm has. And that's also important for us to take into account and discuss it in a political way. In Colombia, indigenous peoples are a priority, and indigenous territories aren't holders. They are public authorities. Through those territories, we don't talk about lands, rather indigenous territories. It's an indigenous government that's there and has been there for a long time and who has been developing according to their internal policies. And also around the public policies who own the territory. That's why we manage it as such. NDC situation in Colombia currently is 2.0, has 32 mitigation measures and 30 adaptation measures, and it describes the mechanism of implementation. But we don't see any in that document the indigenous peoples. Mitigation and adaptation measures report some indicators and Western actions as municipalities, departments, protected areas, among some. The executing institutions are all present except for the indigenous institutions, so we are always left out. So it's important for us to be integrated and to have the acknowledgement, because we need to know the real integration so that we could also, let's say, carry out the execution of the topics that exist. What have we done? We'll present the indigenous Amazonian proposal of updating NDC to the Colombian government through the Regional Roundtable of the Amazon in May 2025. We participated both the technical roundtable with the Ministry of Environment, and we also recognize that the updating of NDC 3 has delayed due to the changes in the leadership and the Ministry of Environment, but we continue to work with our proposals, and those proposals must be included. We trust that the Colombian government will present NDCs in COP30. So we trust the government that our policies could appear or be reflected there, and for them to become a reality. And so Colombia can also present that during the COP30. What do indigenous peoples in the Colombian Amazon propose for 3.0? First, fair energy transition, also to demand for the FPIC or CPLI and ask for oil transition, direct climate funding to have direct access to this funding through the Indi Fund, for example, indigenous knowledge and education, meaning that our knowledge should guide the climate action. It is their property to take care of life in the region.
Cuarto, gobernanza
Fourth,
territorial y justicia
territorial
climática.
governance and climate
Es reconocer a los
justice.
gobiernos indígenas
Recognize
como entes
indigenous
climáticos
governments as
supranacionales y nuestros planes
climate
de vida
bodies
como entes
and
plurianuales
our
de acción
livelihoods
para el
as a
clima.
planning system for climate.
Como quinto, tenemos participación
Fifth,
plena y efectiva.
effective and whole participation, meaning then the binding participation of the climate participation and the official participation of Colombia versus or via climate change. So before September 20th, 2025, we must work around mitigation measures and adaptation implementation mechanisms, for example, regarding indigenous territories, and the inclusion of this measure should be drafted. We must recognize the indigenous territories. Every climate action should be developed from the knowledge systems about Colombian Amazon region. We also have there some challenges. The Colombian government still sees climate as an exclusive competency of the Ministry of the Environment and the Energy System. We must understand that the titling of this territory is not a social policy. Rather, it's a measure for life, and it should be coordinated with the Ministry of the Environment and the Land sector in Colombia. The lack of coordination delays policies and could avoid points of non-return in the Amazon region. We've also done a very important work, and that it's the only way for us to continue to protect the territory. And we've said that regarding the reservation, it will be the best way to preserve and to continue living life. So we've carried out a very important work that we also did in the COP16 by gathering more than 1 million worldwide signatures. And we say that we could broaden 30 million of hectares in the Colombian Amazon region regarding indigenous reservation, as it's the only way we demonstrated that we could continue to preserve the territory and to continue to talk about biodiversity and climate change. And we've proven it. There's no other way to continue to conserve or preserve it, because there are other areas that we also respect, is where there's the greatest rate of deforestation in Colombia. Thank you very much. Thank you, Osvaldo, for your presentation regarding the posture of the indigenous peoples in the Amazon region regarding NDC in Colombia. Let me now pass the floor to Levi Sucre, the Mesoamerican Partnership Coordinator and MPV. Levi. You already introduced me. I am an indigenous breeder in Costa Rica, and I work with the Pan-American Alliance of Peoples and Forests. I'll then talk about the experience of Costa Rica regarding NDCs. When NDC began, there was no participation in the indigenous peoples when those NDCs were drafted. The consultation of the national strategy was being, let's say, finished, and there they took some elements to include those or include them in those NDCs. We are now updating those NDCs that are reviewed every 5 years, and there is a participatory process of indigenous peoples in those updatings. And it is based upon the results of the National Red Strategy consultation, which was a very long one with indigenous peoples, which basically is framed in 5 topics. First, legal sanitation, protected areas and indigenous peoples, and the relationships of overlaps, cultural use, etc. Third, an environmental payment proper to indigenous peoples. Fourth, a definition of forests from the cosmovision world vision, and fifth, a permanent dialogue with indigenous peoples. Now, regarding the three last ones, which has to do with the dialogue, payment, and forest concept, we're working around a tool which is the territorial forest environmental planning. And there we approach inclusion, governance, women, benefits, and about those topics, we are working and trying to propose 6 items of NDCs for the government, because we talk with the Climate Change Directorate for this. Regarding the 2 first, which are the important topics having to do with land tenure and protected areas, we are discussing with the government because Costa Rica, and as a result of the RED consultation, we have the RTI plan, which is the land recuperation plan or recovery plan, but it is very slow because these are legal processes. These are legal disputes that have to go to court, and we're all stakeholders who have illegal tenure always defend themselves, and this makes it very slow. And the discussion we have with the government is that they don't want to establish a goal to know exactly what are the hectares to be recovered, as this is very uncertain. What we've agreed right now regarding the land topics and having to do with the protected areas is to mention in the NDCs that we're working now, but we haven't been able to establish a goal, a specific goal, that by 2030, for example, the government will recover X number of hectares. That we haven't been able to aim for. So, to summarize, we are now carrying out a work with the Directorate of Climate Change that leads us to establish indicators based upon the indigenous peoples directly. And these 2 regarding lands were still unsolved. We will meet perhaps from here to October to be able to coordinate a specific commitment, because sometimes what we say in Costa Rica is that commitments should be measurable and verifiable, and that is where the government is being very, let's say, careful not to establish a specific number to be included in their NDCs. To summarize, then we have proposals about women, about to rescue cultural knowledge, where the governance systems in territories regarding climate, and we have another one, but I don't remember, about the implementation of the territorial ordinance in indigenous forests.
And we pendants that have to do with land tenure and the cultural use of these indigenous territories and these protected areas. That is the case in Costa Rica. Okay. Thank you very much, Levi, for your input from the Mesoamerican League. And we will hand it over now to Marino Gastiva, who is a member of the National Coordination of Articulation of the Black Rural Communities, Quilombo Community, CONAC, in Brazil. Marino, you have 8 minutes. Marino, the floor is yours.
Bom dia, eu sou Mário. Sou Mário.
Good morning. My name is
aqui no Brasil,
Mario,
na região
known as
nordeste
Marinho in Brazil.
desse país.
I live in the
Nós temos
northeastern region of Brazil.
1.300.000 quilombolas no
We
Brasil.
have a
Eu
million
acho que foi dos principais trabalhos que
300
a gente
members
fez
of the
sobre essa questão de
population in this
mitigação
territory, and this is
climática.
one of
Ao
the
meu
main
ponto de vista,
works
foi
conducted in climate
conseguir que
mitigation.
o
And
IBGE
the purpose
localizasse onde nós
is
estávamos, né?
to manage
Quais os
the
biomas que
IPG
nós estávamos,
to
porque
locate
sempre a
where
gente
we
escutava
are,
que
the biomes,
não
as
tinha
we are,
povo preto, não
and
tinha
in
povo
the
quilombola na Amazônia e em outros
because
biomas.
we used
Então
to
a gente,
hear
quando
that there were
conseguiu
just
isso
a
lá em
few
2020,
black
só
people
se
and
concretizou em 2022,
quilombolas,
a gente
which are
conseguiu
the
provar
Afro-descendant
que
communities in
temos
Brazil.
mais de 1.300.000
So in
quilombolas no
2022, we
país,
managed to
que desses
prove that we have over
1.300.000, mais de 900.000 está na
1,300,000
região
quilombolas
nordeste,
in
mais
Brazil,
precisamente no bioma
and out of
Caatinga, que eu
these
acho que é o único bioma
900,000
totalmente
are
brasileiro,
located in the northeastern
e dessa
region, in the
população,
Catimba region,
mais
which
de
is purely
15% está na
Brazilian.
Amazônia,
In this
né? A
population, out
Amazônia
of these
também a
population,
Amazônia também é
over
quilombola.
15% is in the Amazon, also in the
E
Quilombola Amazon.
com todos esses estudos que foram
And
feitos,
through all
a gente
these
também
studies
sabemos que
conducted,
dos nossos territórios
we were able
quilombolas, só
to
apenas
learn that
3%
in
são
our
desmatados,
Quilombola territories,
enquanto
only
os territórios
3%
particulares, mais de
are
20% são desmatados no Brasil. Então, a maior mitigação
only
climática para o
20%
nosso
are
povo
deforested in
no
Brazil.
Brasil é a questão da
So
regularização
in
fundiária
Brazil,
dos
for
quilombolas.
people, the most important thing
A gente
is
conseguir
to have
que o
the
governo
legalization
regularize
and
os nossos
for the
territórios
government
para
to
que a gente continue
formalize our territories to.
fazendo essa mitigação climática no país.
So if we start
Nós
our
conseguimos,
this way,
temos
we can start our
várias
climate
ferramentas
mitigation
de
in Brazil.
luta conquistada pelo movimento quilombola hoje no
We
nosso
have
país.
many tools.
Estamos tentando o reconhecimento
We have many tools
da
that we are using in order to
NDC,
obtain the
o
record
povo afro-brasileiro,
or the
povo afro-brasileiro, o
recognition
povo
of
quilombola
the
dentro da NDC,
NDCs
porque
with
temos
the
várias
Quilombola
ferramentas
for the
como
Quilombola peoples.
uma
And we have
PNGCAT,
many
que foi uma
tools
lei criada, foi uma lei criada agora há pouco,
like
ano passado,
an act created last year,
que é a Política Nacional de Gestão Territorial e Ambiental Quilombola,
the National
onde nós
Territorial
conseguimos fazer o
Management
georreferenciamento
Policy
do
for
nosso
the
território,
Quilombola people
conseguimos
with the
fazer
georeferencing
formação
of our
de
territory.
lideranças,
Through
de
these
mulheres, de
georeferencing,
jovens,
we managed
para
to
tratar
obtain
questões
information
climáticas,
and
conseguimos
training about
ajudar ainda mais
youngsters for
preservar
youngsters
essa
and women.
questão ambiental,
So this climate
com a lei brasileira.
related knowledge can
Também
help
temos a
even
questão do nosso
more
CA, que é o CA coletivo
through the
focado na questão
Brazilian
ambiental
law.
rural, que a gente quer que
We also have the collective
a
rural
NDC,
cadastre or
dentro da NDC,
registration
comece reconhecer todas essas lutas, todas essas ferramentas de luta que
to
o movimento
recognize
quilombola brasileiro tem, né? E começa a
the
nos ouvir,
the
e comece
tools that the Quilombola
a
people
colocar
have
os
and
quilombos
these tools.
nessas
So we have
negociações
this
também, principalmente
land
de financiamento,
register
de
or
construção de
registry
financiamento
related
para questões
information.
climáticas do nosso
We also
país,
have the
né?
financing and financing options
O CAR
so
é o
that this
cadastramento ambiental rural
climate
dos
related
nossos
issues
territórios, é um
can be
cadastramento coletivo
tackled. We have the
de
National
todos os
Rural
nossos territórios,
Registry,
que
which
não
is a
permite que
collective
os
one.
fazendeiros, não permite que
It
outros
includes all the different
agentes venham
territories,
sobrepor
and
as
this
nossas áreas
registry
de
or
preservação.
this land registry allows
Isso é muito importante
to know what are
para
the areas to
a
be
questão
preserved. So this
climática,
is
para a
very
questão
important for
da
climate
mitigação climática hoje
related
do
issues
nosso
and
país,
mitigation
principalmente.
thereof nowadays
E
in Brazil
estamos nessa
specifically.
luta efetiva
Therefore,
de
we are
construção da
undergoing this
NDC.
struggle
Fizemos
of
uma
building
carta
the
junto
NDC.
com
We
os povos
wrote a
afrodescendentes
letter
latino-americanos, caribenhos, para o
along with the
presidente da COP,
Afro-descendant Latin
apresentamos
American
essa carta a eles,
populations.
pedindo que
This
o
letter was
reconhecimento
submitted
do
to the
nosso povo
president
dentro
of
da
the
NDC
COP,
brasileira, que
and we
essa criação,
requested
que
the
essa
recognition of our people and the
que
creation
essa criação da NDC também seja pautada por nós,
of
povo quilombola,
of the NDC to be done by our people, by the Quilombola people in Brazil, including the climate adaptation portion. Our country is huge. It is gigantic, specifically in terms of the biomass. And every day we suffer, we undergo institutional racism or institutional racism, inclusive even in the NDCs fail to recognize their people. This is, we call it an institutional discrimination or racism. It is within, it is embedded in the government. Since decades ago, we have been struggling with this for decades, and we need to address this on a daily basis in our country. And our struggle is huge. It is a struggle by the Afro-descendant populations to be able not only to combat the deforestation in our country, but also the lack of financing from our governments, so that we are able to achieve this climate mitigation. In the northeastern region where I live, we are experiencing droughts. There has been a long time without any rainfall. And the intent is, we didn't manage to end droughts, but we learned how to live with droughts. We learned how to strengthen our people with the climate that we have, in the midst of the climate we have, and we need to learn that this is our climate. We need to make sure that we address all the regions that we have in the northeastern region. We should take this knowledge to other regions so that together we can manage to strengthen and address all these deforestation-related matters. Thank you very much for your contribution and the contribution of Brazil, reminding us that another huge ethnic group inhabits the Amazon, like the Afro-descendant peoples. Thank you very much. We will pass the floor to Francisco Perez now, who has something to share with us. Thank you, Margarita. Yes, we have another survey where we want to ask you if you have participated in the development of the NDCs in your countries. So feel free to write or share your thoughts through the poll or through the chat box. Feel free to share any experience you have had.
Igual esta información lo vamos a como tener grabado acá en el y compartirlo posterior.
We will be able to share this information later on with everyone in order to enrich our discussion around NDCs and spaces for advocacy that have been taking place.
Bueno, tenemos casi 30 respuestas a la encuesta. Gracias a
We have 30 responses. Thank you for those people who have replied. I see that there are some comments through the chat also. In Dominican Republic, Red Afros has also participated in the process of updating. That's awesome.
Sigan llenando, por favor. En el chat o en la encuesta, ¿está bien?
Please continue to fill out the survey, the poll, through the poll or through the chat
Creo
box.
que ya estamos,
We
Francisco.
appreciate your
Seguimos
replies. I
acá.
think,
Sí,
Francisco,
parece
we're ready?
cerrarla. Bueno, sí.
Yes.
Entonces, ya cerramos
Yeah, okay, so
encuesta.
let's close the poll.
No, creo que nos
Okay,
permite
well, I
compartir
think
las
that
respuestas
we are
específicas acá, pero igual como
able
mencioné,
to
podemos
we
como
cannot share the
revisar eso
specific
y compartirlo posterior.
answers, but we can share it later on. We can share it later on.
Agradecemos la participación y paso la palabra de nuevo a Margarita para
Thank you for your
continuar.
participation, and I will hand it over to Margarita
Bueno, muchas
to give
gracias.
start to the
Estamos
next
entonces
session. Thank you very much.
entrando
So
al
now we are
último panel, antes de la intervención final
entering
de
the
Carla,
last panel before
sobre,
Carla's final
con
intervention.
representantes de gobiernos y
Only with
representantes
government
de otras
representatives
instituciones
and
de sociedad
representatives
civil.
of other institutions from the civil
Y
society.
vamos entonces a
And
hacer
we
tres
will
preguntas,
ask 3 questions,
cada una de ellas a los
each one of them
representantes de
to the 3
gobiernos y
representatives
entidades
or the government
para en un
representatives
tiempo
or
récord
entity
de 2 y 3
representatives,
minutos
so that in
podamos hacer
record
3
time,
rondas
2 or 3
con estas
records, we
personas.
can
La
do
primera,
3 rounds of questions
vamos
with these
entonces
participants. So the first one is,
a presentar a los
okay, so we will,
panelistas. La
first and
primera
foremost, we
es
will
Hannah
introduce the
Girardot,
panelists.
que es
We
de
have
Sociedad de Género
Hannah Tiradu,
en
an
la
associate of
Alianza
gender and
NDC.
youth in the
La
NDC
otra persona es Rachel
Alliance.
Monago,
We have
que
Rachel
es directora
McMonagh,
de programas de cambio
Director
climático
of
en la
Programs
empresa.
Climate Change
La otra
Programs in
persona es
Odessa, and Bevioska
del
Kishpri
Ministerio del
from
Ambiente del
the
Perú.
Ministry
Y
of
la
the
otra
Environment in
persona
Peru,
es
and
Mask
the other
Puig,
participant is Mask Puig
la entidad que regula
from the
cambio
entity
climático en
regulating
República
climate change
Dominicana.
in
A todos
Dominican
ellos
Republic.
bienvenidos y
So
entonces vamos a
welcome
empezar
all
con
of
la
you,
primera pregunta.
and we will get started. First
Perdón,
question
un
is,
pequeño cambio con
uh,
la colega Berioska Quispe.
there is
No se va a
a
poder
slight
unir, pero
change. Our colleague Berioshka Kishpe won't be able to
unir
join us,
Mora, que
but
es la
Jimena
directora de
Mora,
mitigación
the director of
del MINAM en Perú.
mitigation of the MINAM in Peru, will be joining us instead.
Sí.
Okay.
Jimena Mora, okay.
Bueno,
Okay, that's fine.
entonces, este fue un cambio de última
So
hora.
this was a last
Entonces, la primera
minute
pregunta
change. So the first
va dirigida
question
a,
will be for
a Hannah Girardot.
Hannah
Tiene
Girardot,
que ver con,
and it has to do
en la NDC 3.0
how it has to do with
puede
how
incluir,
NDC 3.0
los
can
derechos
include
territoriales como una
territorial
medida
rights
de
as a measure,
mitigación al cambio climático.
as a
Aquí vamos
as a
un pasito más
mitigation measure
adelante.
for
No
climate
solamente
change. So we're
reconocerlo,
going a step
sino
ahead,
incluido
not only
en la
recognizing,
implementación
but also
de,
including it
de
in the
acciones de mitigación.
implementation of
Hannah,
mitigation
buenos
actions.
días.
Good morning, Hannah.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Margarita, for having us here today, and thank you for the team for the invite. Fantastic to listen to the presentation so far. I'm really excited to dig into this a little bit more today. Just as a quick context for everyone, the NDC partnership is a global coalition which brings together more than 250 members to deliver on ambitious transformational climate action to achieve the goals set out in the Paris Agreement and drive sustainable development. So through the partnership, countries draw on expertise and funding to turn their NDCs into actionable policies, programs, and projects. And we've been supporting countries to also enhance and develop their NDCs 3.0 over the last couple of years. And we very clearly, I think folks have mentioned already, know that we are not yet on track to achieve these goals. We have gaps in implementation, we have gaps in ambition, in financing, that all need to be addressed to achieve this necessary course correction. But one of the kind of fundamental needs around raising ambition that I specifically work on within these NDCs is looking at the support to member countries in making sure their stakeholder engagement processes are inclusive and meaningful. So ensuring that those who are impacted most on the ground by climate challenges are engaged from the beginning in policy design through to implementation. It's also critical that they have access, as was mentioned already, to financing where it's needed, and that there's appropriate follow-up and transparency around how inputs and considerations from Indigenous peoples, from Afro-descendant communities, local communities are integrated into these policies, and that engagement is sustained over time as well. We're looking at a very specific moment, a very critical couple months, but we also need to be ensuring that these processes that are being carried out now have a plan to be continued in the future. So I know we're moving quickly today. I just will note we released a best practice brief last year on whole of society approaches to inclusive stakeholder engagement that pulls from experiences across our membership. And in there, we outline a number of considerations that we encourage members to take on as they plan out stakeholder engagement processes. One of the big examples highlighted is in Peru, showing leadership on this front. I think there's a lot more we want to say, and so we'll want to make sure the other panelists have time, but just noting that in these really uncertain times and amidst a lot of political transitions, the consistent acknowledgement of rights and the participation of Indigenous and local communities is absolutely critical to the success of our goals. And these policy documents are an important baseline, but there's so much more that I think we'll get into in the next round of discussion as well. Thank you so much.
Muchísimas gracias, Hannah. Y damos la palabra a Jimena Morales.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Now we hand it over to Jimena Morales from the Ministry of the Environment of Peru. Same question.
Muchas gracias, Margarita. ¿Qué tal? Jimena Mora.
Thank you very much, Margarita. Jimena Mora. It's a pleasure. First and foremost, I would like to, on behalf of my colleague who was supposed to be attending initially, but she had an emergency to address. So about your question, about how we can improve the way we address and mitigate climate change and related measures, I would like to comment about how we have been working within the framework of the alliance with the FCLB. With this alliance, in Peru, we are co-leaders of an area of action for the support of Indigenous populations and local communities. So in this context, we have launched the initiative to manage to recognize collective rights, which in turn is an enabling condition. It is very important for countries with tropical forests, because this can ensure the preservation of forests. And the FLP presented recently an initiative that has to do with this commitment, basically an intergovernmental
regarding
commitment around
tenure
land tenure
for Indigenous peoples and
Indigenous
communities and local communities,
populations and local communities,
13
where 13 countries
were added,
were
obviously one of them
a
is
part
Peru.
of.
And this initiative
And
looks for
this initiative of
to
countries with forests
define a
define a
number
numeric
for the
goal for the
recognition
recognition
of the
over
rights
land of
of
this local
local
and
communities.
Indigenous
And of course,
populations. And we are
the idea
expecting
is
to
to
count on different
have
diverse contributions to be able to
all of
announce
this
jointly
to be mentioned.
in Quito.
Jimena, disculpa un segundito. Hay algún problema
Jimena,
con el sonido. Nos
just
dicen
a
que no
second.
se está
I
escuchando.
think we are experiencing
No sé
technical
si por
problems.
favor
Just a second, please.
no, no eres tú, es algo más con la interpretación. No sé si la interpretación nos puede
Perdón.
dar revisando, por favor. En inglés se oye 2 intérpretes y mucho ruido.
Ok, me avisan entonces.
Sí, fue
para
en
continuar.
inglés, creo que el problema.
Ok.
Okay. Hagamos una prueba. ¿Están todos escuchando ahora bien?
1, 2, 3. We're testing English. 1, 2, 3.
En el chat.
1, 2, 3.
Ya, sí están escuchando. Ya, disculpa, Jimena. Gracias.
No, perfecto. No. Bueno, como les venía comentando,
As I was saying, well, this initiative
este compromiso intergubernamental
and
sobre la tenencia de
this
la tierra,
commitment of land tenure what really is looking for is to basically have diverse contributions that could be announced during the next COP30 in this November. And let me say also that a few months ago, during the Climate Week in London, there was also a launch in order to promote this commitment, this intergovernmental commitment, and it should be accompanied by the announcement of a financial package, which is called Tenure and Forest 2.0. And the idea is to have a long-term funding and a flexible and direct management towards initiatives led by Indigenous peoples and local communities. The funding or the financial package for the land tenure was launched by the financial group of this forest, which is called the FDG, in COP26 for 2.7 million. No, I'm sorry, 1.7 billion by 2025. In this context, we've been working with tropical forest countries and members and non-members of LSLP to define a goal that could contribute to an intergovernmental commitment, and this aligned with proposals of NDC, aligned with the possibility of national context and, of course, institutions in each of the countries. That will be everything on my side. Thank you, Jimena. Let me pass the floor to Rashid from Alandesa to answer this first question about the approach that territorial rights must have with an NDC 3.0 as a mitigation measure to the climate change. Good morning.
Thank you, Margarita. And many thanks to all for this opportunity to participate in this webinar and learn from all of the panelists and the wonderful questions coming through. My name is Rachel McMonigal, and I'm the Climate Change Program Director at Landesa. We are an organization, an international civil society organization that has worked in over 50 countries in over 50 years to secure land rights for Indigenous peoples and local communities. With regards to this specific topic of the NDCs, Landesa has worked with a number of governments over the past 5 years to integrate land tenure into their revised NDCs. And through that direct interaction with governments, it sparked a curiosity in us to review all existing NDCs. So in July of this year, we reviewed 170 of the available NDCs. So this was a mix of revised NDCs as well as older versions of NDCs available to examine the inclusion of land tenure and how land tenure was being discussed in those NDCs. We found that less than 28% mentioned land tenure and less than 13% committed to strengthening land tenure. We found that within that, less than 12% mentioned gender equitable land rights. And so this sparked an interest in us to create technical guidance on how countries working on their revision of their new NDCs or countries interested in revising their implementation of existing NDCs could integrate land tenure. So we're working on technical guidance. It's a brief that will be coming out in advance of COP, and we'll be presenting on it at a side event at COP. And we're hoping that it can be a tool for governments seeking to not only elevate territorial rights, but specifically land rights in a variety of senses. So it includes guidance around the necessity to include time markers, area markers, gender commitments, as well as free and prior informed consent, as other panelists have mentioned. So stay tuned for that guidance coming out soon.
Excellent for that contribution that we will be having that comes from Andesa in order to guide our vision about territorial rights of peoples who inhabit in the tropical forests. Let us now continue with the second question. And in this case, We ask, what are the risks, existing risks, for those countries that do not want to incorporate territorial rights and considerations about territorial rights in the implementation of NDCs? So, from the obligations of countries' standpoint, is there any mechanism in order to promote those rights for them to be implemented in this sense? And then we are inviting Rachel to answer this question.
Thank you, Margarita. To elaborate a bit more on the research that was done earlier this summer, we found that 90% of the NDCs with land-based goals lacked tenure safeguards. So these were goals seeking to advance climate mitigation through a variety of approaches, primarily the creation of national parks or conservation zones that would push out existing environmental stewards that have been living on those lands for generations, or other commitments through the expansion of renewable energy infrastructure, the creation of carbon markets, and other climate solutions that require a significant land footprint. So we were really concerned to see that only 10% of those goals that are involving land include land-based safeguards around tenure. We found that when tenure is not adequately incorporated, there is conflict, there are human rights violations, and of course, when free, prior, informed consent is not adequately implemented, there is a decreased efficacy of the climate action that is meant to come out. So not only are we seeing devastating outcomes for the community, but we're also not seeing the environmental outcomes that were originally intended by the actions.
Muchísimas gracias, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Let us now pass the floor to Jimena Morales from the Ministry of Environment of Peru.
Gracias, Margarita. It's Jimena
Thank
Mora,
you.
Morales. Pero bueno,
It's
perdón,
Jimena Mora, not Morales.
Entonces, bueno, como sabemos, las NDCs,
As we know,
pues, tienen
NDCs
que ser implementadas en
have
el
to be
territorio.
implemented on the
Y para ello,
territories.
clave,
And for this purpose, it's
considerar
key
la
for
seguridad del
countries
derecho
to
de tierra,
consider
la
the
asignación de
safeguard of
derechos,
light tenure,
sobre aquellas
and
pues,
specifically
tierras,
over
o
those
zonas aún no
territories that do
categorizadas,
not
que no son
have a
categorizadas.
category,
Y, por supuesto, también
and
no
of
tienen la
course,
gestión adecuada, ¿no?
as a proper
En el caso de
management.
Perú, la
In the
asignación
case
de
of Peru,
es
the
más
allotment
allá
of
de una
rights
condicional
goes
base
beyond
para
an
poder
enabling
implementar.
condition to do
También
the
es una medida de
implementation.
mitigación que hace
Rather,
parte de
it's
nuestro
also a
NDC,
mitigation measure,
específicamente una medida
specifically
en el
a
sector
measure in the UTCUS sector
de uso de tierra y
of the
cambio de uso
use
de
of
tierra.
land and the change
Esta medida la
of
llamamos
land use.
asignación
We've
de derechos
called
en
this
tierras no
the,
categorizadas en la Amazonía.
let's say, the
Incluye
allotment of rights in
dos
the Amazon region. It includes two modalities. So the titling in native communities in the Amazon region, as well as the categorization of indigenous reservations for indigenous peoples in isolation or initial contact, which is called PIATSI. Currently, in the framework of our NDCs, and of course the work we do in implementation, as well as a contribution for the commitment about the land tenure, we are working in the framework very closely in coordination with indigenous organizations that represent the Amazon region, and of course with subnational governments or regional governments to update data that allow, let's say, to know the gap of this allotment and propose actions by 2030 allowing to close this gap. That is what I could say on my side. Thank you, Jimena. So let's now ask this question to Hannah.
Thank you, Margarita. I think just building on what has been shared already, there absolutely the greatest risk we see is that the commitments, the environmental commitments that are so necessary to sustaining us will not be achieved. But I think we also risk exacerbating existing inequalities, climate-related injustices. We have examples of our country members that are working or taking steps to try and mitigate those risks. We have a request from Chile to develop an assessment of Indigenous vulnerabilities and adaptive capacities in response to climate change, to document community-driven strategies and collect recommendations on how traditional knowledge can be adopted into wider national adaptation strategies and measures. So there's some steps that countries are taking as kind of leaders in this space. And I wanted to just note that another substantial risk is that without the proper and meaningful stakeholder engagement at the onset of policy development or enhancement, no matter the community, but we're speaking of specific communities with specific priorities as the conversation today, you'll miss out on the necessary kind of buy-in and shared engagement, shared responsibility from those impacted to implement these actions if we're kind of looking at a national policy. I greatly appreciated what Mr. Sucre shared earlier from Costa Rica. We're also working to build out support for the government in Costa Rica to host participatory workshops. And an active piece of this request that they have submitted to the partnership is around hosting the workshops, having the conversations with specifically women in Indigenous communities, but then also ensuring the analysis is shared back and that it is translated into local languages, the NDC is translated. So I think really taking the necessary early steps to create meaningful and equal partnerships is key to kind of mitigating this risk. Maybe one more quick example, we just concluded our recent youth engagement forum where we partnered with UNDP, but also the International Indigenous Youth Forum on Climate Change and Youngo, the youth constituency to the UNFCCC. And I think there were many conversations. I'm happy to share the link to the recordings. It was a successful dialogue that took place last month. But I think one of the bigger risks as well is alienating the future generations that are currently leading many of these conversations and will be so impactful to carrying out the implementation of these commitments and policies as well. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Hannah. Bueno, tenemos la
Thank you,
última pregunta, la última
Hannah.
ronda.
We
La
have the
primera
last
va,
round of questions, and the last
Jimena Mora,
would
del
be
Ministerio de
asked
Ambiente del Perú.
to Jimena Mora.
¿De qué manera las obligaciones
How
que
do
se
obligations
salen de las
that
NDCs
are
se ven
out of NDCs
fortalecidas o
become
más bien se ven
strengthened
retadas
or
en otros
challenged
planes nacionales
in
o
other national
políticas
plans or
u
other
obligaciones
policies
derivadas de
or
leyes
obligations derived from
diferentes? Entonces, ¿de qué manera se ven
laws?
fortalecidas
So
o
how
se
are
ven
they seen
retadas por políticas
strengthened
nacionales
or challenges by
que
national
coexisten con
policies
las
that
derivadas de la
coexist
NDC?
from those derived from
Gracias por la
NDCs?
pregunta, Margarita.
Thanks for the
Bueno,
question,
comencé a comentar
Margarita.
que en el caso
Let
del
me
Perú,
say that in the case of Peru,
considero que
I
estamos
believe
trabajando
that
para
we are
políticas sean
working
fortalecidas, ¿no?
for
Porque
their strengthening. In
contamos con una
fact,
ley
we
marco sobre
have
cambio
a,
climático y esta
let's say,
reglamento,
framework law,
pues indica que
and this
cada
indicates
ciclo de
that
NDC que nosotros tenemos que
every
comunicar a la
NDC
convención
cycle
de
that
cada
we
5
have
años, como saben,
to
pues además nosotros
communicate,
tenemos que
well,
considerar
we also
propuestas de
have to
los
take
pueblos
into account
indígenas
proposals
originarios.
from indigenous
Y además,
original
por otro lado,
peoples.
cuando se estuvo
On the other hand,
trabajando en el
when we
proceso de
worked
consulta
with the
pública que se
consultation
hizo para
public
aprobar
process to
elaborar y aprobar este reglamento,
elaborate and approve
pues
these
en este
norms,
contexto también se creó
we also created
la plataforma de pueblos
a
indígenas
platform of
para
indigenous
enfrentar el cambio
peoples to
climático.
face climate change. Here in Peru,
La llamamos la PEPIC.
we call it the PEPIC.
Entonces, esta plataforma es un
So this
espacio
platform is
que
a
ha servido
space
mucho para
that has
fortalecer,
been
por
helpful
supuesto, ¿no?
to
a toda la
strengthen
acción que viene
all of the action and the coordination with those peoples. And this is done, or through it, we're able to manage, coordinate, disseminate, and do follow-up of all the proposals of adaptation and mitigation measures related with indigenous peoples or originary via climate change. What we look for is to value the knowledge of these peoples, their practices and their knowledge, traditional knowledge and ancestral knowledges. This platform, we believe it is one of the main achievements within the accords in the previous consultation processes when we made this framework law. And there are 7 organizations participating which represent indigenous peoples in Peru. Some are in the Amazon region, and this is how this platform was created, through a ministerial resolution approved by the creation and operation of the platform. We must highlight that this platform makes part or has representation of the Ministry of Culture and the Environmental Ministry in Peru. They are very active. So on September 10th and 11th, we will having the 6th national meeting in Lima. We will have the representatives from these 7 organizations, and in this case, in this 6th meeting, one of the main points of the agenda, well, we must report about the progress of the updating process in 3.0, and this is one of the main points that organizations are interested in. So that would be on my side. Well, thank you, Jimena. Let me pass the floor now to Rachel to answer the same question.
Thank you, Margarita. In our review of the 170 NDCs, we were noticing that even those that mentioned land tenure, it was truly a mention or a comment rather than a commitment or an action or a target associated with the recognition of land tenure in achieving climate action. And so our interest in developing this technical guidance was to offer
Rachel, please, can you wait a little bit? There is no translations for English.
Absolutely.
Please, the company can check if... Ahora sí.
Para español, sí.
Yeah, ahora sí. Gracias. Sorry, Rachel. Now it's okay.
Wonderful. I was sharing that in our review of the 170 NDCs, we had noticed that when land tenure was mentioned, it was truly as a comment or recognition of the role of land tenure, rather than a commitment or a target or an action that governments intended to take. So in our creation of the technical guidance to support governments in integrating land tenure into their NDC, we wanted to include sample language or templates for integrating indicators and targets so that government's recognition of land tenure shifted into an action that they were bound to. And so within that, we wanted to recognize all of the other commitments and limited resources that governments are being challenged to spread their spread thin. And so we were leaning upon existing global frameworks that are tied to land tenure and that governments are already reporting on. And 2 ones that I want to highlight here are the Sustainable Development Goals and the UNCCD's commitment to land tenure integration. So for the SDGs, we are offering up the target 15.3, which is looking at combating desertification and land degradation. Target 1.4, which is looking at land rights and resource access for men and women, and then particularly target 5.A, which is looking at women's land rights and seeing how governments who are already reporting and committed to these SDGs could translate that into their NDC and use the existing data there to further bolster their climate action. For the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, their commitment to land tenure through decisions of the past few COPs have really created a platform to support national consultations on how land tenure can contribute to combating drought, land desertification and land degradation. And we're seeking ways that in pursuing these national consultations for the UNCCD commitments, governments can also be building in those discussions and those collaborations into their NDCs. So it's uniting different agendas under a common banner of using land rights for those environmental outcomes that we seek. So there'll be more information coming out, like I mentioned, in the technical guidance brief coming out in the next few months, but additional resources and targets and sample language will be available then.
Mil gracias, Rachel. Por favor, Ana, nos
Thank you, Rachel. Now, Anna,
da su opinión sobre esta pregunta.
can you please give us your thoughts on this question?
Hannah?
Thank you so much.
Hannah?
Yes, can you hear me? Okay.
Sí.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for this question. I think so much has been shared, and Rachel, we can't wait to see the technical guidance and hope we can share that on our knowledge platform with our members as well. I think that's a really incredible tool to be out there. I think from somewhat of a higher level, NDCs are these complex and interwoven documents. They're pulling together sectoral plans, short and long-term priorities. They're aggregating inputs from across the country, across communities, but they're also one piece of this landscape that my colleagues have shared. And all of that needs to be aligned if we're going to meet our goals in a sustainable and a just manner. So in terms of the national context, the NDC partnership is working very hard to link these climate commitments to national development planning as well. We have focal points in ministries of finance and planning. There's a lot of work that my colleagues on different teams are doing to ensure that the right people are engaged, that the development priorities and needs that the government is prioritizing align with climate commitments. So a lot of the work that we do at the partnership is around this alignment and ensuring these development priorities are connected. We'd like to say climate for climate's sake will not work. So these commitments need to be embedded in national budgets. They need to be embedded in sectoral development plans, the sustainable development goals, et cetera. And then the flip of this is that commitments in the NDCs should also be reflected in some of these other processes. So I think this is especially relevant for this conversation where examples of how Indigenous and local approaches to resilience and adaptation, biodiversity, combating desertification can be incorporated into policy documents beyond the NDC. So really looking forward to working with colleagues that we're engaging with today on kind of how that looks in the future as we look to implementation. And then I think, as was noted, there's a lot of opportunity for alignment across international commitments. So we work really closely with the NBSAP Accelerator, looking at decision-making and representation. We're currently linking our in-country facilitators who operate in nearly all of our member countries to enhance the coordination and planning that the NBSAP facilitators, a small handful of them, are also engaging around. I think this is very clear to folks on the call that the land tenure commitments cut across various elements of the Rio Conventions. I think there's a lot more conversation around opportunities to think about these synergies. So very happy to be sharing this effort with colleagues from the NDC side. I think I'll end there. Yeah, thank you.
Bueno, mil gracias, Hannah. Con esto damos por terminado esta sección,
Hannah, thank you
este
very much.
panel,
This
con
would be the
estas
end
tres
of this panel
respuestas
with
a las
these
tres
three
preguntas.
answers to the three
Y
questions.
pasamos
And we
si
will
no hay alguna otra
go
sugerencia,
ahead,
Carla, tú me dirás,
in
a
the
la
absence of
sección que
any
va a ser
more
coordinada por
suggestions, we will
Francisco
go
sobre
ahead
las
and
respuestas
start our
que se han
session
dado a la encuesta que él hizo. Y
about
finalmente,
the
Carla
answers to address the
nos va a
answers
cerrar
to the poll that
con los
Francisco
pasos siguientes
did. And our
este
colleague
webinar.
Carla would close this webinar with the next steps.
Sí, tenemos algunas preguntas que Francisco fue colectando.
So we have some questions from, or some answers to the question. Do we still have time for some more answers?
Según mi reloj faltan 10 minutos
Well, I think we have 10
minutos
minutes
y
to
tenemos
go, 12 minutes to go, and we still
respuestas
have
y
the
tu intervención final, Carla.
to share the answers and your final words, Carla. Okay.
No, qué pena, creo que sí, eran
I think
precisamente para lo de las
we have
las
just
preguntas.
we only have time for the
Pero igual eso está como en el sistema que no lo podemos hacer
for,
ahora, pero
for the question. This is part of the
veremos después.
this is the answers is
Sí,
actually
entonces,
in the
chicos, si puedes
system.
decirnos las
So
preguntas, las principales preguntas, tal vez una para
and
cada
perhaps you can
panelista.
give us the
Creo que algunos
questions for
líderes
each
tuvieron que
one of the
salir.
panelists. I
No
think
más
some
de
of the
3
leaders had to
preguntas,
leave.
por favor, chicos.
No more than 3 questions, please.
Yo no las tengo
Perfeito.
aquí.
Vocês me ouvem bem?
Yo te invitaría, Carla, si las tienes, para que nos las
Carla,
se las
if you
hagas
have
a
the
los panelistas,
questions,
porque no las
perhaps you
tengo
can
aquí.
go ahead and ask them to the
Sí, Chico
panelists
las
because
va
I don't have
a
them here at hand.
las colectó de
Yes,
todas las
we'll
preguntas
do
que
so.
recibimos.
From all the
Então,
questions that we
vamos lá.
received.
Para Fernanda, as NDCs garantem de forma efetiva o direito à participação de povos indígenas, afrodescendentes e comunidades locais? E como
In
enfrentar a falta
okay,
de
this is about the
representação
participation
desses
of
grupos nos
indigenous peoples,
processos de
how to address the
decisão?
lack of representation of
Para os
these groups
líderes que ainda
in
estão por aqui,
decision-making processes
ouvem todos
for the leaders
vocês,
who
vi de
are
uma
still
pauta similar, vi que as pautas são similares, mas os caminhos são
undergoing these
diversos. Vocês já estão atingindo
conditions. I know that there are
conjuntamente a
different
abertura para ações coletivas?
paths. You are
E muito rapidamente,
collectively
Fernanda,
articulating
a parceria
the
NDC tem
actions that need
algum
to be taken for
contato direto
collective
com
action.
povos
The
indígenas,
NDC
comunidades
partnership
afrodescendentes
has
e comunidades locais?
does it have a
E para
direct
encerrar,
contact
brevemente,
for local
qual a
and
atualização
Afro-descendant
sobre a
and indigenous
promessa?
populations?
Já
And to close
existem
with, what will be
diretrizes
the
ou uma meta em
updating
termos
about
de
this
quanto se espera
promise? Do we
arrecadar?
have
E
guidelines
como
or
a
goals
pledge, a
in terms
promessa,
of what
tem trabalhado o
type
tema
of
das
collection
populações
are we
indígenas,
expecting?
afrodescendentes e
And
quilombolas
how
que
is the
estão fora
promise,
do bioma
or
amazônico?
since the promise is
Então, são
working
essas
with
perguntas.
indigenous and quilombola populations um, outside of the Brazilian biome? Those would be the questions.
Começo? Então, muito obrigada a todos pelas interferências, foi muito
Thank you very
interessante.
much
Agora eu vou falar em português.
for the
E
interventions.
sobre a pergunta da
This is very important. I
participação,
was
a gente
speaking in
está
Portuguese
analisando,
about
sim, se houve participação
I will be
no
analyzing
processo de desenho
whether
da
there was
NDC.
participation or
De
not.
modo geral, tem uma participação,
In
pelo menos
generally
simbólica,
speaking,
das populações indígenas em
there's at
especial.
least a symbolic participation of indigenous
Mas a participação
populations,
precisa ser vista não só no processo do
but
desenho, mas o
participation has
desenho,
to be seen not
implementação
only
e
as the
monitoramento
design
também,
process,
né?
but also
Que esses
design,
espaços sejam
implementation, and monitoring
garantidos
as well,
dentro do desenho da NDC.
so that these
Para esses
spaces can be
espaços,
guaranteed within
para
the
que haja
NDC
participação, é
design,
preciso que os espaços
so that there can
existam.
be
Então, a criação
participation. In order for there
desses
to be
espaços
participation, there need to be
institucionalizados
spaces. So the
dentro do
creation of these
arcabouço
spaces
governamental, não só na política da NDC, mas como bem
in
mencionou
the
a Hannah,
institutional framework,
das
not
políticas
only
setoriais,
within
das
the NDC
políticas
policy, but
internas
within
do país, do
territorial
planejamento, seja
policies and
também
internal
desses
country policies
espaços
and planning as a
de
whole.
participação
So
e
these
consulta,
spaces,
que seja regularizado a consulta livre, prévia, informada, exemplo
we
do que
need
foi dito
this
no
free
Peru, que tem
consultation and previous and
uma lei
informed
que
consultation to be
regulamenta
regulated. Like Peru
essa
mentioned, there is a
prática
law, there's an act that regulates this
em todo o processo
practice.
político de legislação. Esse é um outro ponto que a gente pode levantar. A contínua
There's another
capacitação
point that we
das
can
lideranças
address, the
comunitárias,
continuous
indígenas, afrodescendentes e de
training
outros
of
tipos de atividades para que possam
community
traduzir
leaders,
as suas
grassroots leaders,
necessidades em
Afro
linguagem
communities,
técnica, que isso
Afro-descendant
possa ser
communities, and
introduzidas
leaders, and
às políticas
indigenous
públicas também
populations
é muito
and leaders,
importante.
so that their
Outro
languages
ponto que
can
eu queria
effectively be
destacar é a
translated into
necessidade da
public policies.
transparência
Another point that I want to highlight is the need for transparency. Transparency of the implementation of climate policy so that there can be a monitoring of populations that wish to participate, that have their demands addressed within the climate policies and political and other public policies. And well, I wish I hope to have been able to address the concerns with my answer. And I would like to continue with the question that is addressed to me. If we have a new commitment, have the commitments been ensured? In terms of the commitment in terms of land tenure in this Climate Week in New York in 2 weeks or less, we are expecting to be able to comment on this approach. So that this could be announced in COP30. Everything would have to be very much in hand with the financing that accompanies this proposal. So this is what we have thought from the government, to have an approximate or a proposal to this New York Climate Week, and also tell you that this commitment would include, in addition to the number of hectares, the new hectares that we are expecting to be recognized. There's also work around strengthening the management of those lands that have been recognized by indigenous people and local communities. This is what I could tell you. I hope to have answered the question. And the last questions, there's a last question.
Claro, a pergunta para Hannah foi
Okay, the question for Hannah is whether the partnership, the NDC partnership, does it have direct contact with local Afro-descendant and Indigenous populations? Hannah?
Thank you. Thank you so much. The NDC partnership is a member-based organization. So we have 250 plus members at this moment. That's made up of country governments as well as implementing and development partners. And this membership is open to applicants. So if there are organizations here today that would like to be involved in supporting countries in their requests to strengthen and to implement their NDCs, we very, very actively encourage engagement there. And I'm happy to answer any questions further on that front. In terms of direct contact, I think that much of those engagements happen at a country level. So we have focal points in governments. We have in-country facilitators that are embedded within the government to support them in their NDC planning and implementation. And in many ways, I think many of the countries that are present or have been discussed on the call today have strong coordination mechanisms and legal requirements to engage Indigenous communities and peoples in that type of the NDC development, analysis, or maybe even sectoral engagement, sectoral implementation planning. So in that sense, there absolutely are direct engagements, but on kind of the international level, we work through our members and our partner organizations. I hope that was helpful. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a todos los panelistas. Margarita, ¿estás por ahí? Creo que no te va. Quisiera agradecer mucho a todos por la participación. Sabemos que 2 horas, dedicar 2 horas virtualmente a veces es
I would
difícil.
like to thank everyone for the participation. I know it's difficult. We would like to give a key information with key people who would like to give you or could give you the key information that we just need. On behalf of RRI, we will publish the model. You will find it in social media. We will send it to the coalition, to RRI, and we will be working on a campaign so that all the data coming out of from our research will be known by governments and they could be rectified because we are still on time. I really want to thank all the Indigenous leaders, the NDC partnership, and also the Fernanda for her research. The investigation is not over. We also want to continue with the countries of Africa and Asia. We want to thank the MINAM from Peru, and we will have other webinars for these regions. We want to thank you for your participation, for being here for almost 2 hours. The number of participants has not dropped even after 2 hours, so we are very happy. This indicates that the webinar was very successful. Thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.